Welcome. My name is Rebecca Ramsay, and today I'll be discussing some research recently published by Paul and Orton. As you can see, it is titled Correlates of Suicidal Ideation and Self-Harm in Early Childhood in a Cohort at Risk for Child Abuse and Neglect. This research was conducted in response to the rising rates of early childhood suicide in the US between 1999 and 2004. Sadly, it's now recognised that children as young as 4 years old are capable of forming and carrying out suicide plans. As self-harm and suicidal ideation are the most widely recognised predictors of future suicide, these are the behaviours of interest in the current study. Suicidal ideation refers to thoughts of suicide, while self-harm describes all forms of self-injury, including actual suicide attempts. Researchers have only just begun exploring early childhood suicide, and therefore limited information exists regarding the correlates for suicide in this group. While there is a plethora of information available on older age groups, we don't yet know whether these findings can be applied to early childhood. Researchers are also yet to examine suicidal ideation and self-harm as distinct constructs or explore their longitudinal trajectories. In response to these gaps in literature, Paul and Orton aimed to examine the prevalence, persistence, and longitudinal trajectories of self-harm and suicidal ideation in early childhood. They also wanted to begin exploring which types of maltreatment and mental health symptoms would associate with self-harm and suicidal ideation in this group. So as you can see on the screen, they formed 3 hypotheses to test. First, they hypothesized that abuse and neglect would show significant relationships with both suicidal ideation and self-harm. Second, they hypothesized that internalizing and externalizing symptoms would associate with suicidal ideation, and internalizing symptoms would associate with self-harm. Lastly, they hypothesized that suicidal ideation and self-harm would persist from ages 4 to 6, and a transition from suicidal ideation to self-harm would occur. Today, for the purposes of time and clarity, I have chosen to focus on hypotheses 1 and 3, as I feel that they are most central to this research. To test these hypotheses, Paul and Orton conducted a secondary analysis of data that had already been collected as part of the longitudinal studies for child abuse and neglect. This is otherwise known as LongScan. Children in LongScan had all been identified as being at risk for maltreatment, and they'd been recruited through Child Protective Services, healthcare clinics, and foster care programs. Participants in the current study were 1,090 primary caregivers of children at risk for maltreatment. The majority of participants were biological mothers, and there were smaller portions of other relatives, as well as adoptive and foster parents. 3 sections of the LongScan data were utilised for this study. Suicidal ideation and self-harm were both measured using single items from the child behaviour checklist, and this was completed by caregivers. Maltreatment was measured in 2 different ways. First, the parent-child conflict scale was used to measure psychological aggression and minor physical assault, and again, this was completed by caregivers. They also included the number of allegations made to Child Protective Services. These were sorted into emotional maltreatment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, lack of adequate supervision, and failure to provide. There were also a number of covariates measured, including socio-demographic information. So let's have a look at the results. In terms of prevalence on the left-hand side of the screen, both suicidal outcomes for ages 4 and 6 were between 1.5 to 3.9%. There was some persistence in both of the behaviours, so looking at the middle of the screen, 33.3% of 4-year-olds with suicidal ideation persist until age 6, and 27.9% of 4-year-olds who self-harm persist until age 6. Transition information is presented on the right. There was 1 4-year-old with suicidal ideation who transitioned to self-harm by the time they turned 6, and 2 4-year-olds that had transitioned from self-harm to suicidal ideation by the time they turned 6. Results from multivariate regression models show that no maltreatment type was found to be associated with age 6 suicidal ideation, and failure to provide was the only maltreatment type found to be associated with age 6 self-harm. Overall, the best predictors of suicidal ideation and self-harm at age 6 was suicidal ideation and self-harm at age 4, respectively. Turning our attention to the discussion now, mostly the hypotheses were not supported. To remind you, hypothesis 1 was that abuse and neglect would show significant relationships with both suicidal outcomes. However, the only maltreatment type associated with either suicidal outcome was failure to provide, and therefore this hypothesis was not supported. The authors suggest that the non-significant findings may be to do with the co-occurrence of maltreatment types, where it's not possible to distinguish one from another in the current study design. Due to this, they recommend that practitioners assess for suicidal ideation and self-harm when any of the maltreatment types have been identified. So while this may be true, I believe this finding may have occurred because of the methods used to collect maltreatment data that may have led to significant underreporting. So first, Child Protective Service allegations are known to only represent a small portion of actual maltreatment that occurs. And second, caregiver self-report of abusive behaviour is also likely to be underreported, even if confidentiality was assured. So therefore, I think we can only assume that these measures are very conservative estimates of actual maltreatment, and therefore I wasn't surprised to see that no maltreatment type, besides from failure to provide, significantly associated with suicidal outcomes. We also wanted to have a look at the third hypothesis, which was that suicidal ideation and self-harm would persist from ages 4 to 6, and a transition from suicidal ideation to self-harm would occur. While there were high rates of persistent behaviour, and this is what was hypothesised, there was no real evidence of a transition from suicidal ideation to self-harm. And if anything, there were more children who transitioned from self-harm to suicidal ideation, which is the opposite of what the authors expected. Paul and Orton don't provide a reason as to why this may have occurred, but I believe it may have something to do with their very unusual definition of self-harm that they used. While self-harm is typically described as non-suicidal self-injury, which is self-injury without suicidal intent, Paul and Orton also included suicide attempts in their definition. I've attempted to illustrate how their inclusion of suicide attempts in self-harm is problematic at the bottom of the screen. So let's pretend that this is a pathway of a young person and how they might experience a lead up to a suicide attempt. As you can see, self-harm is occurring on either side of suicidal ideation, on the right and the left. Because of this, it's very confusing to know whether the child will transition from suicidal ideation to self-harm or vice versa, because either are possible. Therefore, I wasn't that surprised to see that transition data wasn't as expected. I also just want to touch on a couple of strengths and limitations. I think Paul and Orton did the best that they could with data that was already available and credible. Specifically, the long scan data provided them with a really large pool of participants that probably wouldn't have been available otherwise. They've taken the first step in exploring suicidal behaviours in early childhood, which, given the state of the literature, was desperately needed. I think the fact that their hypotheses weren't supported is actually a testament to this, and there must still be a lot to learn about suicidal behaviours in early childhood that can't just be taken or extrapolated on literature from later childhood or even adolescence. One final limitation is that this research relies heavily on accurate prevalence rates of suicidal outcomes. However, it's widely acknowledged that there can be large discrepancies between the prevalence rates that are self-reported versus caregiver-reported, as in the current study. For example, Coves, Maffei and colleagues found that 17% of children in community samples self-report suicidal ideation, while Whelan and colleagues found that only 11% of caregivers reported either suicidal ideation or self-harm for their children. That's a 6% decrease when relying on caregiver report over self-report, as in the current study. Therefore, we can expect that the prevalence rates found may only be conservative estimates of what's actually happening. I would like to conclude by putting forward a few recommendations of how we can advance research in this area. Researchers could extend on Paul and Orton's findings, specifically exploring why failure to provide was associated with self-harm. Researchers should also consider other methods of collecting data on early childhood maltreatment, and this is in order to address underreporting. They could also separate the definition of self-harm into non-suicidal self-injury and suicide attempts, and this would provide much clearer data on transitions between suicidal ideation and self-harm. Lastly, researchers should consider self-report options for suicidal outcomes, and this would provide more accurate representations of prevalence rates. Thanks for listening, and here are my references.